Yeah, Jnanavaca, when he asked us to speak, said he'd like us to talk about the path to ordination, or as Jnanavaca's been talking in terms of commitment. Bhante Sangharakshita, the founder of this centre and the movement which the centre's part of, and the order that is at the heart of this movement, talks about commitment as a word. He reserves it for ordination. It's quite a particular word in Bhante's sort of vocabulary. He has quite a particular meaning to it. And of course, commitment in this context means commitment to the three jewels, the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha. So it's quite specific. But we thought we'd talk about the path to that sort of point of commitment, the path to ordination. Maybe we'll say other things as well, but that was our kind of brief. And we thought we'd begin more personally with some, in a way, some turning points or reflections on what led us to make that commitment, what led us on that path to ordination. Do you want to kick us off with something about you, but briefly, yeah?
We wrote on our notes short. Very nice to see you all.
Maitreyabandhu doesn't keep to his notes very much.
I do.
Yeah.
I don't actually. So I thought I'd talk about three moments in my life, whether they're turning points or not, I don't know. But the first one I actually had forgotten, and I just remembered it just this weekend. I think it's one of my earliest memories. So I must have been 3 or 4 or something like that. I sort of know the time because I have 3 older brothers, and they would have been at school by then, and my sister, I've got a younger sister, wasn't born then. And I remember there's this time where I had my mother to myself. I come from a sort of working class family with a large family with a failing coach company, but anyway, you don't need to go there. So everyone was always working, so it was very unusual to have my mother to myself, so to speak. And I remember I'd sort of follow her around. I was very, very young, and I remember being in her bedroom, and I felt incredibly happy. You know that experience you can have as a child where I remember it feeling. I sort of became conscious in that moment, for a moment, of being really blissfully happy. And then I suddenly seemed to know that I would die one day. At least that's how I tell myself the story in retrospect. At the very least, I suddenly knew in that moment that this couldn't last. This happiness I was experiencing, this sort of childlike joy I was experiencing, couldn't last. As I said, retrospectively, I thought of it as knowing that I would die. And perhaps that's too far, but it felt like this could not last, like a real sense of that. And I remember crying unconsolably about it and trying to explain to my mother what had upset me so much. But strangely, I'd forgotten that memory until, as I said, just this weekend. Years later, many years later, I even asked my mother about that because the memory is so vivid. I even remember feeling very small in my mother's bedroom. I didn't go into my parents' bedroom very much, and it was an unusual place for me to be. And I remember feeling very small with my parents' large double bed and so on. But she had no memory of it at all, and she couldn't remember that happening. But I remember it very, very vividly. And it's striking, is it, that one of the most important precepts of Buddhism is that all things are impermanent. And it was as if I had some kind of childlike sense of that. Children can be as wise as anybody else. And I had a moment of coming into awareness that I was now very happy, and in that very moment, seeming to know directly and without reflection that it couldn't last and that it would have to end. And I remember being unconsolably upset. Yeah. So I'd forgotten that, but I thought I'd mention that. The next little story I wanted to say is coming here on a Wednesday night. I was 24. I was at Goldsmiths Art College and living in effectively a squat just near the art college. and a friend of mine had been coming here and suggested I come. And I remember the strange feeling of kind of foreboding. I remember feeling, I remember putting it off, having this sort of strange feeling of kind of foreboding. As if I kind of knew that if I came here, my life would sort of pivot at that moment, and I sort of put that off. I only felt foreboding twice in my life. It's a very definite state. You can actually, it's sort of pre-conscious state. It's sort of, you feel it through the body before you can rationalise it. Anyway, I cycled here from Brixton, as I did in those days, and I was always a bit late and sort of forward rolled into the room and then fell asleep in the meditation, which went on for the next 2 years, but that's another matter. I came here and somebody, you all remember, was teaching the mindfulness of breathing, and he explained the mindfulness of breathing, and I knew I was a Buddhist.
Yeah.
I knew I always had been a Buddhist, and I knew I always would be. I knew it immediately, and it seemed to me to be completely self-evident. Even he didn't say anything about Buddhism, he just taught the mindfulness of breathing. But it seemed self-evident. It wasn't a mystical experience. It was obviously the case. And I assumed everybody would see that it was just self-evidently the case, that this is the meaning and purpose of human life. Interestingly, I knew it would be challenging as well. I knew I always had been a Buddhist, I always would be a Buddhist, I was a Buddhist, and I knew it would be challenging. And I remember that aspect of it quite strongly, and somehow it felt that whether it was challenging or not was beside the point. I would be a Buddhist, and that was the nature of things, and that's what I had to be. Yeah. So that was my second little, well, not so little. I think my life did change on its axis on that night, and my sense of Buddhism then has never really changed. I think sometimes one gets a glimpse of reality right at the start, and it feels more like what I've done since then has been working out that instinct rather than learning new things, particularly, although I have. Yeah. And then the last thing I thought I'd mention, because we were talking about Gukyloka, was my ordination retreat. I remember my father saying, "You're not going to become a monk, are you?" And I said, "Oh, no, we don't do that sort of stuff here." And it was the first year we wore robes and shaved our heads. And I came home with these pictures of me in blue robes with a shaved head. So it was a 4-month retreat in those days, pre-Brexit. So we had this 4-month retreat.
Not my fault.
No, it's not your fault. I don't know where that came from. Anyway, it was 4 months. And the ordination in those days then was in the middle of the retreat, pretty much in the middle of the retreat. I was ordained just 2 days before my 29th birthday. And we have a private ordination, a public ordination. We might mention that later, but it's not too important just now. In the private ordination, you meet your private preceptor, you're given your Buddhist name, and your Buddhist name represents who you will become when you're enlightened. So I will become Maitreyabandhu Buddha, as it were. And what I'd done to prepare for my ordination is I'd written my own ritual, because in those days we stayed overnight on our own in the stupa that we were ordained in. I wrote this ritual, which had no literary merit whatsoever, just to be clear. And after the ordination, I recited this ritual on my own. And I closed my eyes, and as soon as I closed my eyes, I seemed to move outside time and space. It is without doubt my strongest vision of how things really are. It was direct, more direct than everyday sense experience. It was sort of supra-conscious, so the idea of whether I was thinking or not doesn't really fit. I remember after the experience, in sort of somewhere within the experience, kind of thinking, well, you could say there isn't a self, or you could say there sort of is, but it's not important whether there is one or not. It's just irrelevant, really. The first thing that happened, in that experience, it was wordless beyond all ways of telling. It was exactly as the sutras say, exactly. Which, given that happened to me, a gay boy from Henley and Arden, it was sort of spectacular. But in the experience, it was like coming home. It was like it was who I really was in a certain sort of way, and it felt like it sort of had always been there. Although, of course, that's not literally the case. And then, as I came out of the experience, I don't know how long it lasted. The visionary sense of it was as if some infinitely compassionate figure had touched me on the shoulder, and I've been looking at my life and life itself through a telescope, and this compassionate figure just showed me that I was looking down the wrong end. So my life, I thought, was tight and narrow and constricted and painful and about me and what I wanted and what I didn't want. And then when I put it round the right way round, it was like, oh, of course, that's how it is, And then I was sort of thrown out of the experience, and I went back to my everyday neurotic self. The door closed. I remember worrying about my name and what would people think of my name and all that sort of silly thing. But yeah, those are my 3 turning points, and I think they all were real turning points in my life. Difficult to tell, but yeah. Why don't you tell us?
Yeah, just before I do, but it's interesting, something that occurred to me as you were speaking is that all 3 of them, in their own way, were moments of intensity.
Right,
I mean, intensity might have, when you were little, it might not have been, well, it must have felt intense.
Yeah, it did felt intense.
Knowing that this wouldn't last.
Yeah.
And then this foreboding and walking in here for the first time, you were obviously, there was a situation of intensity.
Yeah.
And then ordination, of course, was.
Yeah.
I sort of say that because I think one of the things about Jnanavaca was already mentioning our divided attention. I think I feel this. My attention gets very scattered and divided, and the intensity of my practice is weakened. Do you know what I mean? Sometimes I think that actually I'm not living a bad life, but what I am doing is not living intensely enough.
Yeah.
So that it's more like I get lost in trivia, not in something particularly unskillful, but in the everyday trivia that many of us, I don't know, get consumed by, and that's what sort of holds me back. Trivia, lack of intensity.
It's interesting, though, you can't sort of will intensity. You can't just make your life intense.
No.
You can commit yourself.
You can reflect.
You can reflect, but it's something about taking the hold of yourself. So much of our experience just touches the fringes of ourselves.
Yeah.
In a paltry way. Really.
Yeah.
I mean, you were going to tell us about yours.
Yeah, I mean, going back to, just a few of my kind of pivotal kind of moments. I think as a boy I was quite probably intense, and intense in my questioning of what life was and what the meaning of life was. Intuiting that there was some meaning. I didn't know how to sort of even ask what that was. I can remember, I don't remember this actually, but when my mother died in 2011, I was clearing the house and she'd kept a stool project of mine. And I think I must have done it when I was about 9 or 10. Certainly it was in junior school before I was 11. And you could choose any topic that you liked. And I'd chosen the topic, what is life? And then sort of explored that in my own boyish sort of way. And it ended with things like questioning whether death was the end or whether we came back and did it all again. And I'd drawn a little bar chart of, I'd imagined a man living to 100, and every decade I've drawn a little bar chart, bars of happy times versus sad times, happy times in red and sad times in blue, and then added them all up over the course of 100 years and concluded that there were more sad times than happy times. And that if you could choose life, it wasn't a good idea to live. So that was the sort of intensity that looking at the project, the teacher just put tick in a little red. So I think I was questioning from an early age. And all of that got accelerated when my dad died. So I was 11 when he died. And there was my mum. My sister had gone to college, teacher training college. And so in the house there was my mum, my dad and me. And he died, he had a heart attack. Sort of unexpected. He wasn't ill. He was only 45. And there's lots I could say about that night, which was obviously very intense. But it's not so much that night. Well, maybe I will say. So it was the 14th of January. And I can remember I was born into a Hindu family, although I didn't have any real faith in Hinduism. I thought it was all superstitious stuff. And my parents didn't sort of force me and my sister to practice Hinduism. But nevertheless, that night, as I knew he was in pain, I was told to go back to bed. So I was in my room, and I remember trying to chant a Hindu mantra, because that was all I knew, imagining a mala, a necklace of these mantras, surrounding the house, protecting the house from death entering the house. Anyway, then I went to sleep. A cousin had come over to look after me, as it were, while my mum was, the doctors were coming, etc. Anyway, he died. I woke up in the morning and he died, and he died en route to hospital in the ambulance. And I can remember thinking, oh goodness, I should have protected him, not the house. He died, as it were, outside the house. Anyway, one of the consequences of his death was that this sort of intensity about what was going on in life accelerated. What I couldn't understand is how adults around me just got on with their lives. He had, for example, worked hard to provide us with enough money to we didn't have a lot of money, but he'd worked hard, etc., etc. What I couldn't see the point of was, why would you work and save up for things like a car or a fridge or a holiday or whatever it was, and then you were going to drop dead? And why were adults just busying themselves with the business of living, not questioning what it was for? And I had this sort of interest in magic and occult things. And so I tried to contact his consciousness, because I was interested, did consciousness survive the death of the body or not? And I developed this method, this ritual, using a pack of cards. He used to play patience, and I took the deck and I invented this ritual and would ask questions of him, and the deck would reveal either a yes or a no or a don't know. And I got consistent responses to my rather childish questions, but enough to convince me that death wasn't the end of consciousness, and then I didn't know what happened. In my teens, I started reading about Buddhism, not in any deep way. I can remember reading one of those simple guides, beginner's guides to Zen. I didn't understand it. I read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. I didn't understand it. I read another couple of books on Zen, and I decided that I didn't understand a word, but Zen was true. Zen Buddhism was true, and that I was a Zen Buddhist. And mainly I was just going to parties saying I was a Zen Buddhist. Impress people. Nobody was that impressed, and I didn't really know what I was talking about. But I remember reading The Glass Bead Game, Hermann Hesse's Glass Bead Game. Have you read that? I really recommend it. I recommend it, to all of you, but I wish that you could read it as a young person, Anyway, I don't know how young I was, maybe 14, 15, 16, 14 I think. And in the novel, Hesse talks about a spiritual community, an order, a monastic order, who are an order of people who live for truth and beauty. Art and music is very important, particularly for friendship, for meditation, and for finding the nature of reality. And it's a very beautiful and moving book where Hesse explores the problems as well as the positives of the spiritual life. And I can remember this experience of lying in my bed reading it and saying to myself, it was more than just words, it was this heartfelt wish that if only there was an order like this in the world, I would give my life to it. And it felt like a sort of fatal moment in retrospect. And finally, maybe I'll just say my ordination. My ordination, for various reasons, was in India. And Subhuti, my private preceptor and my public preceptor, invited me to be ordained in India if I wanted to go there. I'm Indian, although I've never lived in India. And it felt like, this... And the Buddha, of course, was Indian, as it were. And I thought, yes, I've got to say yes. And when I said yes, I would go to India, he wrote to me saying, great, your retreat starts on the 4th of January and your public ordination will be on the 14th of January. And that was the anniversary of my father's death. And it was exactly 22 years later that I entered the order on the night of his death, as it were. And that felt more than a coincidence for me. So yeah, maybe that's not good. But I think this sort of questing has been... God, I want to say that it's got harder, actually, in some ways. I think as a boy, I had that intensity of questing. As I say, as a man now, I've just turned 60 recently, it's still there, and I do get lost in trivia. It's like I've got comfortable in the Dharma life. Does that make sense?
Bhante really emphasises, doesn't he, beginner's mind?
Yeah, beginner's mind.
The importance of kind of going back to those first experiences. I've been reading Blake a little bit, and he talks about innocence and experience, the songs of innocence and experience. And the assumption can be that he means innocence as in immature and then experience as in grown up. What he actually means is innocence is for him a bit more like faith, a bit more like wisdom, which then has to fall into experience, but then you have to sort of go back to innocence again. That was Blake's. They thought they were contraries, and that innocence wasn't linked with ignorance, but it was linked with wisdom. So as you practice, if you're not careful, you get to know it all too well. At least the words, the metaphors, stories, the institutions even, you fall into experience and start to think you know things, even start to teach things. And it gets more and more important to reascend to innocence. I had the experience of it just recently when I was on a solitary retreat, listening to Bhante Sangharakshita give talks, and just re-experiencing my very early, very naive inspiration when I first came along, which was very naive, but re-experiencing it just recently, it wasn't completely wrong. And I really noticed how there's lots to be said with experience, as it were, growing up, but you can so easily lose innocence in Blakean sense of innocence / wisdom / faith.
Well, if you talk enough about Buddhism, you think you can understand it.
Yeah.
You think you do understand it. And that's a fatal kind of error. Because it those early days when I was reading these books on Zen and knew I didn't know what was being talked about, I was sort of, in a certain sense, closer than if I think I do know what I'm talking about. You know, Padmasambhava, one of his teachings in the Life and Liberation of Padmasambhava that I need to keep remembering is, I do not know, I do not have, I do not understand. I do not know, I do not have, I do not understand. But on the other hand, you do need to study and learn about Buddhism.
Yeah. And you do need to commit yourself.
So why? So that was our next... I don't know how long we've got before the tea break.
Sort of tea break now, if you want to cliffhanger.
Okay, cliffhanger.
A cliffhanger. So why commit? Why ask for ordination? Why bother?
Well, especially if you have this idea that you can keep on going back to beginner's mind and how important beginner's minds are, why would you commit? Because
it's not easy. If somebody asks for ordination, some of you in the room I know have asked for ordination, in Triratna, we kind of always welcome any request for ordination, but then there's a process. You enter into a process which is a testing process, a challenging, demanding process where you have to learn about the Dharma as it applies to you and learn about yourself. And it's not always plain sailing. So why go through that?
So that might be our cliffhanger.
No, I think another... Well...
How many cliffhangers can we have?
Well, I think one of the things that we could end on is to say that there isn't a good reason to ask.
Right, yeah.
There isn't a good reason to ask.
There isn't, no.
But we've got more to say. Yeah. So
if you have got a good reason, that's a good reason not to ask. Yeah.
Yeah.
No good reason.
No good reason.
Okay, cheers.
Tea.
I remember a friend of mine asked me a while ago, what advice would I give to someone who was thinking of asking for ordination? And I said, hesitate. Hesitate. It's a very, very serious thing to do, and I thought the best advice if you're thinking about ordination is hesitate. And then that was reminding me of when I asked for ordination, or realised I was going to ask for ordination. I was on a weekend retreat, and I'd been coming along for a while. I was a mitra, I was a friend of the order. I'd been coming on for a while, and I'd actually managed to get my life on a bit more of an even keel. I was at art school at the time, and I sort of oscillated as a person between sort of mania and depression. You know, I was either the life and soul of the party, or I was really very depressed and sort of locked away from people. I was that kind of person. And coming out here really did help that. You know, quite early on I managed to get myself, after a year or two, I think, on a much better sort of footing. There's still, problems ahead, but I managed to feel at least a bit more easy. And I remember really feeling like I finally got my life a bit more together. My life had been very chaotic and unhappy before then. And I remember going a walk with someone, and they asked me, are you thinking of asking for ordination? And I said, no, I'm not. I've just got my life together. Things are going really well. Things at art school are going well. My love life is going well, so forth. I really felt really clear. No, it's not a good idea. And as I was saying this, I had this horrible feeling that I was going to ask for ordination. It was really quite peculiar. It was like my head was talking, and there was this sort of sense that is exactly what I'm going to do. It was actually really, how you often know, I think, strong experiences because you remember exactly where they took place. It's like a strong experience becomes a place around the experience happened. I remember exactly where this moment happened, and I was trying to say why I wasn't. And in saying why I wasn't, I knew I would. I just knew I would, and it felt like even at the time, like I'd rowed this boat out, and it had been all a bit tricky, and now I was sort of managing the oars and everything, and suddenly I decided to stand up and start waving my arms around and making all this turbulence again, which is exactly what happened. But I think that is actually quite a good example. You know, I realised I didn't decide to. I didn't think, what good reason have I got to do this? I didn't think, on balance, do I want to be Damien Hirst or do I want to be Maitreyabandhu? I was at college with Damien. You know, I didn't, it was just, I knew that that's what I was going to do. In a way, if anything, against my instincts, against my reason, yeah? So, one thing to really be clear about with ordination, it's not utilitarian at any level. However deep you go with the Dharma life, it's not about getting anything really. Getting anything for yourself, it's not about improving yourself, not really about improving others. Of course you do improve yourself and hopefully even help the world a tiny bit on the way, but it's not fundamentally about that. It's about something, for me, that I had no way of articulating. The simple way is to say, you know, do you want to join a quest for enlightenment or not? Is that what you want? Do you want full and perfect enlightenment or not? When I was, whatever age I was then, 25 or so, I wouldn't have had no clue what I meant by that. But something deep within me, as it were, did seem to know, and was set upon that journey, despite my quite reasonable qualms and questions. I sort of knew I had to go. So that's where I wanted to start us. You know, there's no good reason. So if you've got good reasons, that's not a good time to ask. If you do ask for ordination, you want it to be for no reason. If you had to have a reason, it's to gain enlightenment. But most of us are not up to thinking that. Most of us, it's just a bright idea.
I think, yeah, I agree with that. I think most of our reasons for doing things in life are to make our lives better. And by our lives, I mean what Maitreyabandhu was sort of saying are at the heart of our lives is a sort of deluded egotism, that I'm a separate being in a fixed and separate world, and I'm trying to fix my life so that it works as best as it can. And for some people that might be making money, for some people that might be finding the perfect partner, it could be status, it could be all sorts of things. It might be pursuing some sort of vocational urge or drive, it might be a creative pursuit. But normally it's about sort of seeking satisfaction for oneself. And it's very difficult to sort of communicate this, but that's what Buddhism's saying, I guess, is that self-seeking is the very problem that limits our sense of fulfillment and meaning in life. That very sense that I need to make my life okay is the obstacle to consciousness expanding to something that is truly fulfilling. So it's quite hard to sort of talk about asking for ordination as one more thing that will make your life all right, when actually what it's trying to do is undermine the very tendency that we have to make our lives all right. Does that make sense? It's trying to undermine that egotistical tendency to have a comfortable and secure life in order to do something much more radical and much more fulfilling. But from a worldly perspective, something that's sort of counter-intuitive. From a worldly sense, it's like you'll end up poorer, not sort of worldly richer. Yeah. So you have to think about, do I really want that? Do I really want that? For me, like on my first retreat that I went on, which Maitreyabandhu was co-leading, I think Vandana Jyoti was on it. You were, weren't you, on a team cooking for me. Thank you. On that first retreat, I was unsure about this I used to come here to classes and hide in the bookshop area, which was a lot more small than the bookshop is now, and hoped that no order members would talk to me, because I thought they looked dodgy to me. Did they? Well, I mean, I was impressed by something that they seemed to have, and also I thought, is this just some cult that they're trying to seduce me into? And are they really Buddhist anyway? And I went on my first retreat with that sort of question. I drove there, and it was Christmas 1994, and I can remember making alternative plans for New Year's Eve in case I didn't like it. I was going to drive home. I had parties to go to in case I didn't like it. And on that retreat, I decided that I didn't know whether this movement was genuinely Buddhist. I didn't even know whether, it was a dangerous cult, but I knew that it worked. It touched me so deeply. It moved me in a way that I hadn't anticipated. And I met people for the first time who I could relate to at a level that I wasn't able to normally. That I knew that I was going to go deeper with this movement. And I also knew that to answer my questions, I had to go deeper. Because how do you know from the outside? On my second retreat, I decided that I was going to commit my life to this. And that was at Jnanavaca, which was so spectacularly beautiful a place. I decided, and that terrified me, because I then thought, but I don't want to commit my life to this. But part of me knew that I would, a bit like you knowing. And then I moved into a community with Maitreyabandhu and others, and I clung on to my career because I thought, at least that's normal. Do you know what I mean? I'm doing all these weird things. I need some sort of sense of being normal with normal people who don't meditate and do other things. And then the whole question of ordination came up, and I thought, no, I'm not going to ask. And then I went on my third retreat, and I thought, I'm going to ask. I can't help it, I'm going to ask. I didn't even like that retreat. I went to and I thought, I don't like this retreat. I didn't really like the person leading it, or I didn't like the way they led it. Afterwards, they became quite a close friend, actually. But I didn't have a sort of enjoyable time on that third retreat, and I thought, I'm going to be ordained. I just knew it. And then I came back, and a good friend of mine asked for ordination. And I thought, drat, I can't now ask because he's asked, and they'll think I'm only asking because he's asked. So I'll wait 6 months. And I waited 2, I think, and then I just thought, sod it, I have to ask. And there was this sense of dread in asking, and that was right. And I've never regretted it. I've never looked back.
And you did become literally poorer, didn't you?
Yeah, I can remember you saying you don't have to give up your job.
Yeah.
That was a real relief, because I worked in tech, and I had I quite liked my job. Tech was called in IT at the time. Anyway, I quite liked my job. I thought it was fine. And you said to me, you don't have to give up your job. And I thought, that's great. I'm just going to earn lots of money. I'll give some of it to the Buddhist Centre, and I'll get ordained and have everything. And then my job just got more and more intolerable. The more I went on retreat and trained for ordination, the more sort of serious I became about this path to ordination, the more I felt like I was living some sort of schizophrenic double life. I would, come down here in the morning and meditate with everybody, and then I'd have to put on a suit and a tie and go to work and be some sort of manager in this corporate world where nobody was telling the truth. I think that was what really bothered me. It wasn't the work, but it was the culture where lies were acceptable in order to make progress, where you thought you had friends and then they would betray you in order to make progress. Do you know what I mean? It was horrible. And I just thought, well, I'm living a lie here. Anyway, that's a whole other story.
I mean, perhaps we should talk a bit about the path
To ordination.
because I think we wanted to really start by saying that there's no good reason to ask for ordination. It's not another self-improvement thing, although it can, it's certainly helped me in those ordinary ways, but it's not really about that. Enlightenment itself, even when we say egolessness, we've no real grasp of what that means. It's not just the absence of something; it's the presence of something unimaginable to us. But if you emphasize all that side of things too much, it starts to make you look like, well, why, you don't need a path then, you just need to open up to it. So the thing we really want to stress, I think, now is that there is a path. The whole of Buddhism pretty much is a path. It's not a philosophy in the Western sense, it's not a religion in the Western sense. It's a path from egotism to egolessness. And that path is absolutely crucial.
And I think the metaphor of a path is good, because a path is something that you have to walk down. And if you're not taking the next step, if you're just standing still, well, actually, the life overtakes us. It's not possible to stand still, because there's so much about egotism in us, but also egotism in the world around us, that is pushing us backwards, if you see what I mean. So unless you're moving forward, we end up going the other way. So there's always a next step. And I think there's something about being prepared to live a life where there's always a next step. Bhante Sangharakshita, my teacher, says that even enlightenment, even the Buddha, isn't a static state. It's not a state where you just think, oh, I've arrived at somewhere called nirvana, and now I can, put my feet up with my slippers and rest forever. It's what he sees enlightenment as is a ever unfolding progress of creative states, even more creative states, ever unfolding, a sort of ceaseless unfolding of more and more positivity, more and more love, more and more creativity, more and more awareness, more and more freedom, more and more peace, more and more compassion. It's active in that sense, and Buddhism's always emphasised that active nature. So yeah, the path. And you said that, look, even sort of wanting to get enlightened can't, is. But for me, that was the reason. I kind of.
More explicit about that.
I was quite explicit about that. Not that I knew what enlightenment was, but I was quite happy in my life, in some ways. I think the questions were existential. They weren't immediately. I wasn't suffering in an immediate, obvious kind of way. I had quite a good life. But for me, that wasn't enough. And I knew that this sort of goal of enlightenment, at least the Buddhists that I'd read about said that it was possible, that was the state of utter fulfillment and freedom. That was the state of a complete, not just a sort of peace, but also bliss, and that it wasn't in this world of time and space and phenomena. And I was interested in that. I'm more than interested. I was driven to know that. There was this yearning to realise the truth. I studied physics at university because I wanted to understand the nature of reality, and physics unfortunately, it doesn't tell you. But what it did tell me, and mainly what I remember, because I've forgotten all my physics, but what I remember is that our common sense perceptions about the nature of things are wrong. Yeah? Our senses don't reveal reality, they just reveal what the senses are built to reveal. So we're not seeing things as they really are. Physics teaches you that. You know, physicists don't know what matter is, they don't know what time is, they don't know what space is, they don't know what the universe is. They're still, but they do know that the common sense assumptions are wrong. So that was, for me, was a driver, and not just a intellectual bit of titillation. It was an existential yearning.
I think that can be more or less conscious, if you see me.
Yeah.
In me, it wasn't. I was much more unhappy, as you know, and
Yeah.
in me, it wasn't that conscious.
Right. Yeah.
I was sort of driven by something that I wasn't really conscious of,
Yeah.
but it was very, very urgent, nevertheless.
Yeah.
Very, very urgent.
Yeah.
But the thing I wanted to emphasise is that this, you know, we're trying to move to this unknowable state. You know, I always think the best metaphor is this metaphor of, you know, an acorn and an oak tree. You know, if you said to an acorn, what will you be like when you grow up? An acorn could never imagine an oak tree. They'd just think of a shinier, sexier acorn. You know, a kind of, I don't know, been to the gym acorn, you know, drinking smoothie acorn, you know, that kind of thing. You could never imagine the majesty and strangeness of an oak tree. And I think that's about as good as metaphor for enlightenment as we have. So when we think, what am I going to be like when I grow up, we think of us just as a sort of shinier version of ourselves. Buddhism is trying to say there's an unimaginable potential. It's uneasy, this language of potential now, because everyone's talking about fulfilling their potential. Artists talk about it, sports people talk about it. Everyone wants to fulfill the potential. But it's a sort of secular idea of a potential. The Buddhist idea of potential is beyond what you could imagine. And yet it's, as it were, already there, in the acorn. That everything of that oak tree is, as it were, so to speak, metaphorically already there. But there needs to be a path between the acorn and the oak tree. Unimaginable though that becomes in its later stages, there must be a path. And the important thing about that path, it needs to be a coherent path. It needs to, in other words, to be a path, not a jumble of different tracks in the wood. Not a bit of a road here, little track over here, a car park over there. It actually, a path implies a starting point and an end point, and you're moving along it. What Buddhism is trying to offer you a coherent path. And that's very, very countercultural now. I was just saying recently the weekend that, you know, especially with the YouTube phenomenon, you know, you can listen to a bit of Sam Harris, you can listen to someone talking about Neo-Vedanta, you can listen to Christian Gnostics. There's some very interesting stuff out there. And the modern instinct for modern people will be to think, okay, which bits of those paths will work for me? You know, like people sometimes come to Triratna saying they like the Sangha, they like the communal aspect, but they don't much like other aspects of it. Or they go to Zen and they like the meditation aspect. You know, the instinct can be that the modern instinct is to look around and find bits of the path you like. So it's a bit like having all these maps made by different map makers and ripping out the bits of the maps that you like based on your own preferences and then sticking them all together in the hope that it will lead you somewhere. Now I can understand why people do that, because I've done it a bit myself and it is quite exciting. You know, you find, you know, you listen to a bit of somebody and they're saying some juicy thing you haven't thought about, the metaphors are new, it's all quite exciting. It usually runs out on you fairly soon, and then you find another bit. But what happens if you do that, stick lots of different maps together, you just get either a no path or just a path that leads you back to yourself. It's, in the moment it can feel like you're edgily finding your own way, but actually all you're doing is finding your own way back to yourself. I don't think, in my experience of seeing quite a lot of people doing that, because in my day, you never heard about Buddhism, you never heard about Advaita Vedanta or non-duality or all these things. So you need a coherent path that you can actually walk along, not a sort of collage of paths which you put together on the basis of your kind of likes and dislikes.
I think that's right, because Because the very act of trying to knit your own Buddhism, as it were, find a collage that suits you or me, is the sort of very motivation behind it is egotistical, to do something that fits with me again. Do you see what I mean? That's why it doesn't work. Well, that's one of the reasons why it doesn't work. But also, any Buddhist tradition will tell you that there's a coherent framework of practice that leads you from wherever you are all the way to enlightenment. Any Buddhist tradition will do that. And different Buddhist traditions will put their emphasis in different places. They'll have different cultural, they'll have different cultures, they'll have different practices, they may even have different teachings that seem on the surface of it contradictory. And if you feel drawn to the Dharma, to Buddhism, then in a way just find a Buddhist context that suits you. It doesn't have to be this one. It doesn't have to be this one. I'm pretty sure that if it's a genuine Buddhist context, it will work if you sort of dedicate yourself to it.
With that intensity you
with
mentioned.
the intensity that I mentioned. So this is Triratna, LBC, London Buddhist Centre, is one context. When I came along, there weren't that many contexts. There were a few. But nowadays, we're quite rich in the number of Buddhist movements and different, there's Tibetan centres down the road and so forth. So if you're interested, then you could sort of do a bit of shopping around and see what suits you, what feels right to you, where you feel at home. But then at some point, if you're going to move towards real depth, real expansion beyond egotism, then you'll have to commit to one way of doing it.
I mean, it's really it's a principle of life, isn't it? That if you want to play polo, or if you want to play an instrument, I'm better. I don't know where we got polo. I've obviously played a lot of it myself. Water polo mostly. Let's stick to an instrument. If you want to play a piano and a jazz trumpet, you do at some point need to decide which one to go for.
And that does go against the grain, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. It goes against the grain of our assumptions now, which was always the kind of cherry pick. Kind of understandably, I think, but
if you do choose this path, Triratna, what you need to be aware of is that there are some practices and teachings that we only give to people when they're ordained. So when you walk into the centre and you come to a class like this one or any of the classes here, you don't get everything explained to you, because it's a gradual path. It's graded. It's you have to sort of deepen into it. So not all the practices will be given to you. You have to sort of make a commitment before you can get those practices and train. So all I want to say is that these classes and even this centre isn't all that Triratna's offering. It's like a portal to a whole world of practice that is a coherent path all the way from where we are now to potentially to enlightenment.
And that is kind of, I think especially, I mean not just, but especially after the YouTube phenomenon, the instinct is to go for something much shinier than that.
Yeah.
It's quite difficult nowadays. We're partly as well, but I think because we are now so cerebral, it's very easy to be attracted by exciting sounding ideas and language, and it's quite difficult to admit to yourself, in all sincerity, that you're not integrated, that you don't know yourself very well. So, the path that we teach here at the London Buddhist Centre and at all Triratna centres is, first of all, you need to start with really taking hold of your life, really facing up to who you really are. You don't want this path to ordination or to enlightenment to be based on a bright idea. It's all right to start like that, but you'll soon come a bit unstuck. That's one of the reasons why we emphasise friendship so much, because you also need to see yourself as others see you, because we've all got blind spots, haven't we? Inevitably, we all see ourselves from a particular point of view. So a real path needs to actually be you, the person you actually are, not the person you'd like to be, not the person you'd think you are, and not the person that other people tell you are, but who you actually are. You need to sort of take hold of your life. It's not an easy thing to do. You need to sort of face up to your life. You know, that's how we, you know, and mindfulness of breathing is a kind of symbol of that, where you gather your whole self into yourself. So you're now your whole self wholly attending to your experience. And you always want to, the path always begins with that. And then it moves on to, you need to love. I mean, I need to love. One of the things that, you know, as I said, I came into the Dharma really, really quite unhappy. You know, I was pretty suicidal when I was, you know, a young teenager. When I gave one of my first talks here, sorry to be so personal, but when I gave one of my first talks here, I talked about, I'd just come back from ordination, and my sister came, and after the talk, she said she was really pleased to hear the talk because she felt sure now that I would never commit suicide. And it meant that my whole family had obviously talked about this. And she said I was always worrying I'd eventually get a phone call, you know. And that my family are very, very English. You know, she'd never said anything like that to me before or since. But I was really struck. She said I always expected a phone call. So I came from a very unhappy place. So I needed to sort of take hold of myself, stop pretending I was somebody else, find a way of actually being a happier person, and I needed to move on to this next stage of positive emotion. It's not a very good way of putting it, but really I needed much more joy and love and inspiration and connection in my life. And, you know, the Maitreyabandhu practice that we teach here at the centre is a kind of metaphor for that. It's a practice, but it really is a whole stage where you want your life, my life, to be more and more expressing positive emotion, less and less distorted by, in my case, you know, quite chronic unhappiness. You know, you can't practice, you can't go to enlightenment with chronic unhappiness. You know, you have to go through these stages. I tried to run ahead of that. I remember in my first retreat thinking, all I need to do is do the mindfulness of breathing. I'd read a book on Zen, I think, and I just thought, you know, I'll just crack through into the nature of reality. And I had to go all the way back to gathering up my life, facing up to the demons in my life, finding a way of lifting my consciousness to a higher level, a warmer, kinder, brighter level. And that's been quite a struggle for me. It's not a struggle for everyone, but it was quite a struggle for me. But then it goes on further than that, so perhaps it might be worth saying a bit more about where we go from there, because if we're not careful, you think that's all that we teach here at the Buddhist Centre. You know, integration, taking responsibility for your life. Let's be a bit more positive. We can help each other a bit more. That's not it at all. I would never have done this path just for those good reasons.
Should we have a bit more air conditioning?
Yes, let's
turn
the machinery up.
Could you?
That's great.
Yeah, I think. You know, I was interested in this whole teaching of no fixed self, no self. When I came along, I wanted wisdom, I wanted enlightenment. And what I was taught here initially was ethics. And I thought, oh, for heaven's sake, I don't want to be more kind or generous. Not that that's a bad thing, but, you know, I don't want lectures on how to, you know, give more biscuits or charity or whatever. I want enlightenment, that's a real thing. It took me quite a long time to realise that actually I was again trying to leapfrog over my experience, and that becoming a happy, healthy human being was the foundation for seeing into these truths, like there's no fixed and separate me. If we're not a happy, healthy, integrated, emotionally positive, responsible for our own lives and responsible for our own actions, able to relate to other people in a human, kindly, sympathetic, forgiving kind of way, if we're not in that place, then when we start to reflect or do practices that are aimed at seeing through the nature of our delusion, where we think we've got a fixed and separate self, and we haven't. If we haven't built that foundation, it can lead to serious sort of disintegration, yeah, or it can lead to a nihilistic kind of despair. I went to see a little aside, a film review. I went to see The Stranger, a new film out recently, based on Camus' book L'Étranger, and it's a wonderful film and wonderful book, of course, about existentialism, and it comes at times it comes close to Buddhism, but the conclusion for the protagonist in this book is that nothing matters. Yeah, nothing is important, because everything's empty. And if you're not careful, wisdom teachings in Buddhism could lead you to that nihilistic, despairing place if you haven't understood them properly and if you haven't built this solid foundation of a happy and human self. So that's really key. And then, yes, having built that foundation, and if you've asked for ordination, and when people around you think that you have built sufficient foundation, and that you're connected enough in terms of friendship, and you understand the Buddha's teaching clearly enough so that you're not going to go off into some sort of nihilistic despair, on that basis, at ordination, you're given practices that help you see that delusion of a fixed and separate self. It helps you see, they help you see that our consciousness is not this narrow thing tied around what I call me, that I'm not actually the body, and I'm not even what I think of as my mind. I'm not my thoughts, I'm not my memories, I'm not my personality, I'm certainly not my name, and any other kind of external condition like my career, or, you know, we're not that. And what Buddhism does is it helps you sort of remove all of those kind of obscuring levels of what you think you might be, to see into, well, what's really there. And what you find is really surprising. You find that there's no core, there's no fixed entity there. Instead, consciousness opens up into something radiant. It opens up into something blissful and infinite and boundarylessness. There's no ultimate separation between you and the world and all beings. There is at a physical level, of course there is. There is even at a sort of psychological level. But ultimately, beneath that, consciousness doesn't have boundaries. Yeah? And you can open up into that using the practices that you're given at ordination. We call it entering into practices that lead you to spiritual death, which is not a real death. It's the death of a delusion, the death of the commonplace assumption that we're fixed and separate beings. That's what dies. And when that dies, or to the extent that that dies, a new consciousness opens up that you can't say is yours, you can't say it's not you either. You can't actually pin it down in any way. That is the sort of goal. Even that's not the end point. Because you could say, so what? So what? So, you know, for one of you, maybe this boundless universal consciousness has opened up. What Buddhism then says is that can't be the end point. Great that it's opened up, and you're experiencing boundless love and freedom and peace and so forth. Great, but what are you going to do with it? Yeah, because if you then just, I don't know, sit in your armchair, that's not enough. So in Sangharakshita's terms, what he's tried to create is an order where people are trying to open up in this way, collectively, individually and collectively, so that we can offer something of this transcendental vision to the world. Yeah? So it has to be all the time, it has to be in relation to something bigger than self. It can't be even enlightenment for oneself, that's what I'm trying to say.
It's interesting, I've been thinking recently, you could almost think of it, there comes a point where consciousness turns around on itself. It's as if egotistical consciousness or everyday consciousness, which is just the consciousness that we survived through, it's not our fault, it's not that we, but egotistical consciousness is always sort of spinning around its own axis. Of all the billions of people in the world today, the most important person's day for you is you. We arrange the universe around ourselves. It's as if consciousness is always sort of looking in on itself and arranging the universe around itself and saying, I like these bits of it, but I don't like those bits. I'm closer to this and that. And then in enlightenment, it kind of turns around. Instead of being, circling in on itself and arranging the world to suit itself, it literally turns over and shines out into the universe of love, as boundless love. And that's not just that's not an abstraction. That's expressed in trying to change the world. Yeah. It's not. You don't just sit there, sort of, shining love in all that. You really try and create conditions in which other people can do that.
And that's what the Buddha did after his enlightenment. He was enlightened, we're told, at the age of 35, and then he lived until 80. And so the remaining 45 years of his life, he wandered the plains of northern India, helping other people become enlightened. And from a Buddhist perspective, that is the greatest gift that you can ever give somebody. Now, of course, the world is in parlous, as you were saying. There's people in horrible states in the world, all over the world. You just don't have to look very far. Actually, there's the war zones, but even just walking down the road, you can meet people in pretty bad ways. So human beings need lots of things. They need, ordinary kind of material shelter and so forth, food. But particularly Buddhism is concerned about, what about when people have all of that? There's still this existential question of death, and what do you do in the face of death? What are you going to do with your life? And of course, Buddhism would say that if you don't really address that, if you live for just this egotistical consciousness, that when the body dies, that consciousness continues and grasps after another form, another ego, that it can do the same thing again with. And we just go round and round on this wheel, this cycle, this inexorable cycle of looking for fulfillment, not finding it, and doing it all again. So enlightenment is said to be, in a way, the answer to this issue of life and death. And Maitreyabandhu was saying it's as if this lesson of moving towards selflessness is what we're here to learn. I mean, that does seem, I can't prove it, but it does seem to me what life is for. That's what human beings are here to learn, how to become less self-centered, more open-hearted, more enlightened, more in touch with how things really are, so that the love that releases can heal others. That seems to me the point.
And you need a whole community for that. You need a whole world for that.
Yeah.
Just as you need a village, a whole village to raise a single child, you need a whole world for that. Because when we say, selflessness, you've got all these ideas about what that means, or it's much more than you think. you need, I don't know how to put it really, but you need a whole kind of community of people around you doing that.
And I was saying at the weekend, just on that sort of community, that in one of his lectures, Sangharakshita, it's a lecture called A Vision of History. He talks about history, his vision, a vision of history, his way of seeing human history, isn't through rulers and politics and wars and conquests and so forth. He sees human beings in human history as a warfare, as a battle between two modes of being. One is the mode espoused by a spiritual community that's trying to develop and heighten people's consciousness, develop their consciousness, and a battle between spiritual communities and what he calls groups of people living just egotistical lives, egotism writ large. He sees human history as a battle between spiritual ideals and sort of egotistical ideals. Yeah? And he thinks that actually there have been many spiritual communities, there are today in the world, and there have been through history, who have tried to elevate human consciousness. And, they might succeed for a while and then they get, swamped or destroyed or something. And then new ones rise. So that's an interesting kind of perspective on human history. But looking ahead at our future, this sounds grandiose, but I kind of feel, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, that even if we find socio-political, technological solutions to all the world problems, we won't be able to achieve peace and harmony and fulfillment unless at the same time we've elevated our consciousness to another level, unless we've addressed at a species level this problem of egotism. Because what does egotism do? It keeps causing more conflict. Yeah. So the project that Buddhism espouses is a very sort of fundamental one. It's saying, how do we help each other, ourselves and each other, raise our level of consciousness, raise the level of consciousness of all human beings. And that seems to be the most important thing. Actually, it isn't the most important thing, but maybe we'll come on to that. We've got about 5 minutes.
We've got about 5 minutes. So what is the most important thing?
I know
where you're going, I think.
I don't really know. Well, even that, to say that, look, the survival of our world and our species depends upon the raising of our consciousness individually, collectively. Even that sounds quite utilitarian, as if we should do it so that for the sake of the world or planet or something. It's not wrong, but I don't think that there's something even beyond that I don't really understand. It's like reality wants to be known, and through us it can know itself. Through the Buddha, when the Buddha became enlightened, it was as if an organism had realized reality for the first time, and reality knew itself through the Buddha. And I think there's something in reality, the universe, that is of the nature of consciousness that wants to be known. And it can be known through us, through human consciousness. It's like if you move on this path towards commitment, towards ordination, as Patrick and Thomas and various other people are going to be doing, if you do that, it's like something in the universe will respond.
Yeah.
It's like if you start moving towards the nature of reality, it sort of starts looking back at you. And that can be a bit unnerving. It's like the universe supports this quest to be known. That doesn't mean you get what you want. It might be you get what you don't want. But you do get what you need in order to move forward, if that's what you want to do, to wake up. There's something of a cosmic significance going on, not just at the level of this planet. I think there's something of that, and I don't know what that is. And I can just kind of sense it sometimes in meditation, that ordination, commitment to a transcendental ideal, is to do with something of cosmic magnitude. Yeah.
That might be a good place to finish.
We'll leave it there. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.